Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea Podcast Record Club, where each week one of us picks an album or albums for the others to review, and then we fucking review it. And this week, it's my recommended record, parenthetical S, records. It feels kind of weird to just come out and do a record club on this particular topic, just because it's like there's no build up or anything. There's no pomp and circumstance. Just like, here are two of the most beloved albums of all fucking time. We're talking about Joy Division's two. I mean, they had a third one, but that was posthumous, so I guess that doesn't technically count. But we're talking about the two primary Joy Division records. We're talking about Closer, we're talking about Unknown Pleasures. And the reason that I wanted to do this was multifaceted. One, seeing these two records always get compared to each other, I've never really taken the opportunity to explore which of these records really caters to my sensibilities the most, and I figured this would be a cool excuse to do that. And because I know that Riley and Morgan are both huge Joy Division fans. In the past, I have not been, and then I actually started listening to these records in a lot. I've listened to a lot of shit this week, but I've mostly been listening to Joy Division. And I gotta say, I've really come around on it. There's not going to be a lot of diversity in perspective, but I still want to sort of present the case that Joy Division as a band have become so culturally significant and ubiquitous in the world of alternative music that I still can't begrudge my former self for being a little bit underwhelmed, just because Joy Division, honestly, I think there's a good argument to be made that Joy Division is just as, if not more influential than a band like the Velvet Underground for the world of alternative music, just because their identity, these ideas that they bring to the table with just sort of the iconic post-punk sound, it is baked into everything, far beyond the genres that they themselves stuck to and innovated upon. And especially after, you have New Order after this, I think is an equally as influential band. And it's just kind of interesting to sort of look at the progenitor of so much music that we love, and why I simultaneously can't begrudge newbies for falling head over heels for it instantly, but I can now speak to the lasting appeal of the band just a little tiny bit. But I am the newbie here. I will cede the floor to the Joy Division emo children.
Yeah, so one thing that's worth noting as well, on the note of the post-punk sound, which Joy Division were it's fairly widely accepted, the kind of, if not the originators of that sound, at least the most culturally significant band to emerge and to kind of lay the template out for what that was. But what's interesting to note about them is that originally, when they started out, they were far more influenced by and interested in being a straightforward punk band, in the same vein as what a lot of the other British punk bands that were going around and were making huge waves in the late 70s. They were hugely inspired by the Sex Pistols, hugely influenced and hugely motivated to create that same kind of incredibly bare bones, simplistic rock music. So where so much of the effect came from the power of the performances more so than any of the musical acumen. But what is interesting is that the sound that we come to associate with Joy Division, and that we come to associate with both of these two records, particularly Unknown Pleasures, is something that they kind of stumbled into through their collaboration with Martin Hannett. If it were up to the boys in Joy Division, these records would not sound the way that they do necessarily. They were known in their live show for being much more aligned with and kind of fiery and brutal in the same way as a band like the Sex Pistols. But it was in the studio that the post-punk sound that we associate with Joy Division, that heavy use of space and reverb and atmospherics, that distancing between instrumentation and the mixes, that was all Hannett, and that was his vision and his design. And it was something that was kind of retrofitted to these Joy Division songs as they were being recorded. And it's even worth noting that members of the band were divided for a while on how they felt about that and how they felt about how it kind of changed their sound. Peter Hook was for a long time kind of a holdout on how he felt about the way that the records came out because of that production style. Stephen Morris, I think, has the most diplomatic approach as their drummer, and his belief is that a band shouldn't sound the same on record as they do in a live show, because otherwise live shows become pointless or records become pointless, depending on how you look at it. The idea is you should get a different experience from each. And that, I think, is, I find myself more sympathetic with that perspective, because while, of course, I never have seen Joy Division or New Order for that matter live, I can imagine that this style of music, this kind of coldness, doesn't necessarily translate as well to a live setting. However, when I'm listening to these records, it is so integral to the mood and the feel of these songs. And it kind of ties into the world of gothic rock music that was starting to develop itself. I mean, bands like Bauhaus and early The Cure as well, really working in this
Birthday Party, even.
Birthday Party, absolutely, really working in this kind of dreary, doomy, dreamlike, heavily reverby sound. And Joy Division kind of came through, and then through the production of Martin Hannett, infused that with the essentially punk aesthetics and the kind of, because if you think about it, there's a lot of punk in Joy Division, really. If you think about the compositions and stuff, the riffs and the bass lines, I mean, as memorable as they are, as kind of iconic as they are, they're ridiculously simple a lot of the time as well. Especially Stephen Morris's drum beats have kind of got this industrial tone to them, especially on Closer. And so there's a lot of just musical simplicity that the band used to kind of create a sort of hypnotic vibe that I think is, if you, in the context of 1979 when this came out, a really refreshing take on punk music. And I think one of the reasons why they came to be so immediately influential. Yeah, I mean, what is the Joy Division sounds to you guys, and how integral do you think that sound and production is to the way these records land on the whole?
Where to start? I mean, it is like,
Right.
it is a bit like doing Velvet Underground and Nico, particularly like digging into the sound of a record like that. One that essentially just, if it didn't spawn a genre or subgenre all on its own, then it was certainly the thing that people could point to. To me, Joy Division has primarily been about the rhythm section. Peter Hook on the bass and Stephen Morris on the drums. From the first second that you hear this record, are driving forward this cold gothic music. They're driving it forward with the intensity of an act like the Sex Pistols. And that sort of, that give and take, I think, is really what made this band so special, especially at the time. That rhythm section driving forward so much of the record for pretty much all of its runtime is really, I think, defining to what this band is, especially at this early stage.
Mm.
I mean, there's a reason that like Peter Hook is made, like, is there a bassist more famous than Peter Hook for like being a bassist than him? His style is so distinct, and like I can't remember where I read this. Might have been Stephen Hayden in some form or fashion, but like everything here is really simple and very elemental, but it's being applied in very distinctly like characterful ways. Like Peter Hook was often described as playing his bass like it was hanging like down to his ankles on stage, and he was just like blah, 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 blah. Like he was a fucking madman, and you can tell on both of these albums.
Yeah, I mean, just to talk a bit about the setting and the scene and the musical innovation and stuff, it's easy to forget that when we kind of draw this parallel to Sex Pistols influencing Joy Division and stuff, there was about a 5-year gap between that influence sort of taking hold and, or maybe not 5 years, 3 or 4 year gap between that influence taking hold and this record coming out. And in the meantime, there were unquestionably other bands that had begun to innovate and had begun to establish a template that Joy Division would essentially perfect instantaneously. I mean, the Sex Pistols had already fallen apart, and John Lydon had reformed Public Image Limited, which is one of the great early post-punk bands, especially with their first 3 records, incredible post-punk classics. And I mean, Public Image and Metal Box, I'm pretty sure their first 2 albums had, I think, both come out before Unknown Pleasures was even released. Plus, you also had maybe the post-punk progenitors, which is Pere Ubu as well, having released multiple classics by that point. Iggy Pop having made The Idiot and Lust for Life as well. Talking Heads having come onto the scene with their first couple of records too. So post-punk was already an established,
Wire,
I think.
first 2 Wire records were
Absolutely.
Yeah,
100%. I mean, Wire, I mean, maybe the most explicit example of starting out a punk band and then very quickly pushing that into the abstract. And what I think sticks in people's minds about Joy Division, because they weren't the first, but they had the story, they had the characters, they had they were the band that you could watch and you could see the tragedy that would take place. Essentially, you could see the pain that was going into it. You could see the camaraderie, but also the battling forces within the band as well. Like, it's well documented that Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook never got on very well and always kind of conflicted about the direction that their bands should take. And it was worth noting as well, they were the 2 that initially formed Joy Division, and Stephen Morrison joined later, and then Ian Curtis was recruited as the singer. So it really is like with New Order, Joy Division really is Hook and Sumner's band, and the product of their dueling directions and musical influences. Like, Hook has this real gritty playing style with his bass and a real established tone. I think of his bass tone as kind of being like the bass equivalent of the Johnny Marr guitar tone in the 80s, where you just recognize it instantly, and it is so distinctive that it can kind of hold up a song completely on its own, not that it ever needs to. But then you of course have Sumner's guitar playing, which cannot be overlooked as well. I mean, one of the distinctive features of these Joy Division records is how just utterly earwormy the riffs are consistently, how guttural they sound. I mean, there are production techniques, again, coming back to Martin Hannett, but also in the playing of Sumner as well, that take these riffs to some really kind of bent and warped places. Sumner has a great way of playing his guitar, and of course the way that it's produced as well often makes it sound super distorted, super kind of echoey, and often not quite resembling. I think the line between Sumner's guitar and Hook's bass kind of gets blurred at certain points, because they
yeah,
somewhat similar tone, which is interesting for how different they are creatively. But the synergy of the members of this band, the story of Ian Curtis, even before he had passed away, and the confidence with which this band conducted themselves, I think, even though they weren't the progenitors necessarily, automatically shot them to the top of the pile. Not to mention as well their involvement with Tony Wilson and Factory Records, which is well documented in the movie 24-Hour Party People, which is essential viewing for anyone interested in this era of history and music anyway. But yeah, all that is to say, everything about Joy Division is instantly iconic. I mean, the fact that, you mentioned that they released 3 albums, one of them posthumously. I mean, technically 2 of them were posthumous, because Closer came out after Ian died as well. So Joy Division was kind of this band that really, if you think about it, like in terms of, obviously they had early EPs and their early presence as a live act, but the vast majority of the material that they are remembered for, very little of it was actually released while Ian Curtis was alive. And I say that to emphasize the point that the tragedy of Curtis's death and also the tragedy of how like inevitable it seemed kind of hangs over all of this music. It's doubly true on Closer, but I think on Unknown Pleasures even as well, you get the feeling and the presence of death in the way that Curtis performs. He has this monotonous kind of eerie drone to his voice. Sometimes when he leans into a more kind of pleading style, he can sound genuinely ghostly.
A 23-year-old man who sounds like he is 65.
Yeah.
Like, he sounds like Michael Gira now, singing in his early 20s. Like, that was the thing I kept coming back to when listening to his voice, in terms of like its actual presence and how like monotone it is, so that whenever he kind of raises it so that his voice is really like more present, or he just gets a little bit like a heavier, angrier, is like, where would they live? You're just kind of like, whoa,
Yeah.
slow your roll there, pal.
It's a little Hank Hill.
Yeah. And then like there's a lot of, obviously we're talking about Unknown Pleasures and Closer. There's obviously a lot of great Joy Division songs that never made either of those albums. But if we were to just focus in on these two records, I mean, starting off with Unknown Pleasures, which I think, along with Sgt. Pepper's and The Velvet Underground and Nico, has probably one of the 3 or 4 most iconic album covers of all time.
Yeah.
In terms of just how the image has resonated and kind of passed through and been absorbed by popular culture. I mean, maybe I could even see an argument for putting Unknown Pleasures album cover above those two in terms of influence and significance. It may be the greatest album cover of all time.
I realize it's an Andy Warhol banana, but the Velvet Underground and Nico is just it is just a banana. But this is like extraordinarily singular, and
you can't replicate that kind of like monochromatic style that all of their releases are drenched in. Like, even their like singles releases are all just like black and white, which makes maybe the most like the one of the albums that I know that the three of us love the most, that I think takes more from Joy Division than arguably perhaps any other album or band have, is that it makes the Twilight Sad album
no one can ever know.
No one can ever know. It makes that album's sort of aesthetic feel like it makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, undeniably influential. I mean, even if you just look at the image as well, the idea of sound waves transposed into the visual medium by Peter Saville as well, incredible artistic visionary and designer of many infamous and great album covers. But that idea of the sound waves transposed to look like this kind of like brutal and angular terrain, like it sets you up and it creates a vibe and a feeling even before you put the music on.
An overhead shot of the Kid A mountains.
Yeah, well, that was definitely influenced by this album cover. That mountain design, Stanley Donwood, I'm pretty sure has even said as much. So yeah.
Oh, there is so much kinship between Kid A and Unknown Pleasures. That was like, listening to that this week, I made that comparison, especially in terms with how like ridden with anxiety both of them are, how like fussy they both feel, how tight and skeletal they can both often be, which I mean, not to jump the gun or anything, but I think is perfectly exemplified on Disorder. I mean, I hate like talking about a song like this because no doubt it's been discussed to death, but what a fucking song. Like, the way this starts, I honestly think might have been semi-responsible for my initial reaction to Joy Division, because like the very beginning of this song is like kind of funny sounding. Like, you just kind of hear it and you're just like, it's so stripped back, it's so simple that you're just kind of like, this is one of the greatest albums of all time? Are you fucking... And then the second that guitar comes in, you're just like, okay, never mind. I was full of shit. Never mind.
There's not even just the guitar, it's the way that it contrasts with the hook burbly bass line as well. Look, not to get ahead of I will jump the gun or like blow my load too early, but this is my favorite Joy Division song.
It's
So
up there,
we're,
man. It's
we're
up
I
just
there.
mean,
we're just starting at the top of the mountain for me.
There's no wrong answer. There's not a bad Joy Division song.
No,
It's
and
not real.
it's maybe a slightly basic pick, but also it's a lot of people have it.
yeah, they have like 30 of them total.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Like
The sound of the song, the tone of the song, like I don't know that any song I've ever like that's ever been a part of my life has like felt so like it captures me at a particular point in time, but I guess in general, than this one does. Like it feels weirdly like, even though there's no specific details in it that echo my life necessarily, it feels weirdly autobiographical. I feel myself in it in a way that is more intimate and uncomfortable than most other songs. Also, like when I was a very emo and kind of gothy, just very indulgent teenager, I would kind of make it a point to soundtrack, in a particular era anyway, I made it a point to sort of soundtrack my fucking self-indulgent despair with this album and this song in particular. So it's always going to have a special place in my heart for being it is such a cliche like music fan thing to say, but like, when I was listening to this at 15, I was Ian Curtis, and I had the spirit but lost the feeling, all that sort of stuff. Everything he said just felt like he was coding my DNA into the English language, as stupid as that is. And the song still hits with all of that impact today. I mean, sometimes I I just genuinely can't even listen to it sometimes. Everything you need to know about Joy Division is here. I mean, from that production style, from the way that, again, all four of these men within the first 30 seconds of the song have demonstrated their own individual presence where they stand out and stand completely alone from every other man in this band. Like, first you get Morris's sort of just heavily reverbed but kind of sort of sparse, sputtering, almost industrial drum beat. Then you get that Peter Hook bass line that's so kind of like wobbly and kind of more intense than you expect it to be. Then you get that distorted kind of guitar refrain. And then, of course, you get Curtis himself, who sounds tiny in comparison to the sounds around him up to this point. But by the end of the song has just completely superseded all of them and is just essentially shouting feeling in a way that makes every single other thing around him feel like a million miles away. It's it's a song of a generation in so many different ways, and I can't even speak about it any more than that.
how do you even talk about like "Wish You Were Here" or something like the title track on that? It's just like the North Star for like a incalculable amount of music.
I also want to point out that I do think that a lot of the reasons, perhaps maybe this went for some of my initial distance from the work of this band, but Joy Division have been a band that their catalog has been insanely well preserved over the years. Posthumous releases, compilations, all that kind of stuff, remasters, they're all over the place. I personally listened to the 40th anniversary digital remasters of both albums, which just sound fucking amazing. It just amplifies all of that really sparse, empty space that's in these songs, which I do think is a little bit alienating and can be challenging to engage with. But once you sort of accept that that's the bit, this goes from an interesting song and a cool way to open your record to like a life altering event to like somehow this isn't my favorite Joy Division song, but like again, it's really fucking close. I love how I think the true essence of this band is truly in how like skeletal it is and how simple it all feels, is that it's just sort of like it allows you to feel every single sound and have it feel like it presses into you. I feel like this, in many ways, this is the everything in its right place for Joy Division. It feels like the lyricism here, which I think is like it can't be overstated. Like we've talked about Curtis's presence as a frontman and a vocalist, but as like a writer, as like a poet, he makes this band what it is. And that is, I mean, further emphasized by the fact that when he was gone, they just had to make a new band. Like it's just like, well, I mean, what's the point now? And you can feel it. This is basically a really harrowing recount of like, at least the way I read it is it's an anxiety attack. It's him relaying like sense memory and just like all of these disassociative details of someone who's just like trying desperately to latch onto things in this like completely intangible way. And the way it starts with I've been waiting for my whole life for someone to take me by the hand, it's just like, again, that sort of omnipresence of death looming over these records is that it feels like everything on here can be read as sort of a double meaning for just like a cry for help, basically. And that's why I think it speaks to you so much, or speaks to like teenagers who are in their gothy phase, Riley, is that it's like Curtis's youth is so inexplicably like linked to his artistic identity as a human being. So like his very early on obsession and predilection with death and depression and anxiety and all of these things, it speaks to you in both a really poetic way because Curtis is a great writer, but also in a way where you kind of feel like you quintessentially have to be a little bit younger to sort of understand the headspace that this kind of puts you in.
Yeah, I mean, we don't really have the time to talk about every song on both of these records, but I mean, what are some of the sort of standout moments for you guys? I mean, Morgan, I mean, this is Joy Division, are like, I associate this band, like, this is one of the bands I associate most with you. And so what is you want to talk a little bit about maybe your relationship with Unknown Pleasures, or with Joy Division in general, and what this band and these songs mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I found Joy Division basically through trawling the internet and going through music that was obscenely well regarded on various websites and forums and whatnot. And naturally, you will eventually land on Unknown Pleasures. I had heard a handful of things on YouTube that, funnily, like the big three that stand out in my mind from when I was listening to this band were Love Will Tear Us Apart, Atmosphere, and Transmission, which, funnily enough, none of those are on albums. So I found a vinyl of Unknown Pleasures in a bookstore, and without having heard any of the specific songs on it, I picked it up and first listened to the entire record that way when I was about 14 or 15. Admittedly, some of it was a bit over my head just because I had certainly never heard anything like it before. Not even really the three songs I mentioned earlier. The closest to anything on this album is Transmission. Disorder aside, I think even that's even a little catchier. Like I don't think you'd really call most of what's on here catchy, but it still has this like primal rhythmic energy about it that burrowed its way into my subconscious to where it became a sort of not just a musical but also narrative obsession for me at that age, to the point where it was honestly years before I would get to Closer. I've listened to this album so many times in my life, almost just trying to figure it all out in a sense, because the big moments like Disorder and New Dawn Fades, and even like Day of the Lords or something are relatively straightforward if you have a background in listening to much alternative music. But something like I Remember Nothing or Wilderness are just, they're pushing those boundaries even further, and they can be a bit difficult to acclimate to, I think. But I feel like in doing so, I learned so much about not just alternative music itself, but how to listen to certain kinds of music like this.
I think one of my favorite moments on the album is somebody who's a bit more familiar with it in a piece by piece way is Insight. This is a song that I feel like demonstrates a couple of the sort of secret weapons in this band's arsenal because yeah, they are very elemental and cool, but there are some sort of more ornamental details about the sound here that I think is key, which actually are on Disorder as well. There's sort of these like whooshing atmospherics that come into play in like the second and third halves of the song that you could just kind of barely hear, but like fill out the mix in this really satisfying way. And occasionally on this album, there'll be like a weird, I think it's a synth tone, but like at the end of Insight, this just becomes like the proto letdown by Radiohead, where it just kind of dissolves into all these primitive sounding synths. And the front half of the song is just as mesmerizing because it is this really like hypnotic rhythmic section that feels like tribal almost. And Ian Curtis is just singing his fucking ass. He sounds more despondent on this song than he does on like most of them, which is saying something.
One interesting detail about Insight is that Curtis's vocals were recorded through a telephone line to give it a specific distance. That was one of the techniques that Hannett used to kind of like make him feel kind of far away or just kind of like digitized, I guess.
That makes a whole lot of sense. And I really feel like just with the subject material of the song, it's like when you hear that voice cry out, like, and I remember when we were young, and you're just like, wow, I want to die. New Dawn, and that going into New Dawn Fades is just cheating. Like, fuck you. Fuck all of you involved in this for doing that to me.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus Christ. So you mentioned those sort of whooshing atmospheric sounds. So again, Hannett had a huge role in augmenting these songs and kind of really like integrating the studio and studio sounds into the songs themselves on the recordings. Like he would use a lot of tape echo. He would use found sounds as well. Like he would record things like smashing bottles, breaking glass, weird backwards guitar loops, lots of Beatles influence, I guess, and some of those weirder studio choices as well. And they do turn up a lot on some of the record's more avant-garde moments, like I Remember Nothing is littered with, assorted sounds and bizarro bits of production wizardry. But yeah, Insight's a great song. I love that track. I love how it demonstrates something that's very true, I think, of a lot of Joy Division deep cuts, where it's kind of got this feeling of being in constant motion from the moment it sort of starts. Like it's just kind of it's this perpetually moving thing, and that's a big part, I think, of the industrial sound that Joy Division lean into here. Something they kind of make a bigger part of their songs, I would say, even on Closer. But yeah, Insight's a great song, and New Dawn Fades, I mean, gave the game away with Disorder, but here we go again. This is my second favorite Joy Division song.
It's immaculate.
It is like the riff in this song is just so fucking just ugly and hopeless and brutal, and just there's such a coldness here. It feels like such a distillation of everything that makes this band so powerful. And I mean, one of my favorite songs as a teenager as well, She's Lost Control, comes straight in after this as well. Feels like, again, one of the aspects we've sort of hinted at, but really I think needs to be emphasized, is how groovy this band are within their template as well. Like Day of the Lords has this really kind of like sick, twisted groove to it in the way that the guitar and the bass interplay. And that's even truer on She's Lost Control, which is kind of like a proto weird sort of disco song, not proto disco because disco is already a huge thing by this point, but it's kind of like a post
Day of the Lord starts out like doom metal.
Yeah.
Like, what is happening here?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's true, I guess, on the later songs on the record as well. Songs like Shadow Play as well, where you just have the bass and the tones are just so overwhelmingly gloomy. Like the record really gets gloomier and more sort of despondent as it goes on, which is super fitting, I suppose.
I'm not sure there's anything louder than the guitar on Shadow Play when it comes in.
Mm.
It's just there's so much what feels like at least natural reverb. And if it's not natural reverb, then that's like, what the hell elemental fucking shit were you guys using?
Shadow plays like just fucking, it feels like one of the most just instantly iconic rock songs on this record. Like the riff is so just sizzling and like you say, it's really loud as well. You're kind of uncompromised by how sort of soft the bass tone is compared to how loud that guitar becomes. And it kind of gets louder and louder and louder actually until you get to that part, which is just like such a classic Sumner guitar line. And then Wilderness is like, it's kind of like tripping over itself. I love the weird loping bass part that Hook plays on this. It makes the song feel so kind of weirdly lopsided in a way that throws you
Very
off.
Tina Weymouth.
Yeah, actually, great shout. I think that the record has those surprises packed into the deep cuts as well, like Interzone 2, which is I think the only song that Curtis doesn't sing.
Love Interzone.
Yeah.
This song is just kind of a banger, honestly. It's like the most traditional, like Sumner's work on here in the second half. Blistering shit. Love it. Love it to death.
I just like I remember nothing is just the most like terrifying. It sounds like you were listening to dead people.
Yeah.
This is the sound it makes when you rub people's bones together.
It is the basically the perfect ending for this album. Like it is so chilling and sparse, and it feels kind of like uh, there's so much, the distance between sort of the instruments and the kind of weird nature of the compositions has kind of gotten so far out that this is kind of the logical conclusion of it. Although it's still kind of disarming after a song like Interzone, which is so much more in your face. But then I remember nothing happens, and it feels like a slow death. Like the album is just kind of slowly dying, and you're just prone and completely helpless to save it. It's like this organism that's fading out of existence. And I mean, we.
It's funny because I want to die.
He's like a character. He's like the Spectre character in like a David Lynch film that he purposefully like down tunes his voice to make sound weird. Like fucking oh god, it's terrifying. It's just terrifying. And speaking of terrifying, why don't we talk about Closer? This is interesting because I'd heard these albums back to back originally in like I want to say like 2017, 2018, and they kind of blurred together for me, so I didn't really remember a whole lot about Closer. And while my feelings did significantly improve for Unknown Pleasures, I think my one of my more satisfying Jake character arcs is that Jesus Christ, I fucking love Closer. This is like, I see the vision with Unknown Pleasures, don't get me wrong, but everything about this album that they took a step forward in as soon as a year later just appeals to me a lot more. And I understand why, is because this sounds a lot more like the band's Joy Division inspired that I grew up liking, and that I like. There are songs on Closer that sound like early to mid era The Cure, so it's a little bit more like full sounding, and it has more of a sort of like, you can sort of feel the New Order infiltrating on this album a little bit. Like, not to say that like it would have been 1-to-1 or anything, but like you can feel the different band that Joy Division was becoming with the people who were going to start New Order. It just happened to have Ian Curtis in it.
The rhythm section gets a bit more insistent, I would say, on this album. Like the rhythm section is very, very well formed on Unknown Pleasures, but here it gets a little bit more like it's kind of pushing and wriggling within the songs instead of like some of the songs here go to, it seems weird to say this in comparison to Unknown Pleasures, but like darker places sonically compared to that record as well.
It's darker and also like even more erratic and kind of disturbing just sonically.
Well, it's like
Not to mention lyrically.
it opens with the the I Remember Nothing type song of this album, the 6 minute sort of formless repetitive drone of Atrocity Exhibition, right? It puts that front and center, and immediately you're kind of kicked off with that, like one of the most iconic. I mean, one day we have to do a video on like iconic drum fills that open albums, because this is like top tier. It's like, yeah, it's that beat, but it's also like it feels like it's cascading across the mix as well. Like it is. You feel like some kind of twisted, mutant carnival is sort of just strolling through your town as you listen to
it
this.
reminded me of Time Escaping on the new Big Thief album a little bit, with the way those drums cast. Like it's the same technique, and I rarely ever hear it.
Yeah,
I love that
you're
shit.
spot on. It is the same fucking thing. And
where people will come to step inside.
Yeah, I mean, it's still produced by Martin Hannett again, but it feels like this is sort of less polished. Not that, yeah, I think that's a fair thing to say. It's kind of, there's a little bit more, the distortion is a little bit more racked up. Sometimes like it will overwhelm the songs entirely, even as they continue plodding along. I think they do this in Atrocity Exhibition to a certain extent as well. Like Morris's drum work is really anchoring it, but if it weren't there, the whole thing would just be a haze of noise, essentially, with Curtis's voice sort of cutting through. Yeah, and I mean, then you go into Isolation, which is just like, you've got that proto sort of very, very early 80s synth sound that I have a massive nostalgia for, because like my dad would love so much music that has this kind of like chintzy sort of keyboard sound, and it's so just satisfying to hear it here. And it's such a weirdly, like it's got this kind of like poppy sort of insistent bright quality to it, but it's kind of like warbled and too like saturated as well at the same time. It's a really eerie, bizarre song. And I mean, from these first two tracks alone, you've got these two songs that are moving at very different paces, that are doing very different things. It's a really disorienting way to start off a record, especially compared to the natural and kind of easy to sink into way that Unknown Pleasure starts.
And Curtis on Isolation sounds like he is singing from the very back of a 30-mile long garage. Like he just sounds so distant, especially when you compare to how he sounds like, that cutting quality as an Atrocity Exhibition, which, by the way, lyrically speaking, I used to kind of think that this band being named after such a dour real life thing. For those of you who don't know, Joy Division is, I believe, a segment from a concentration camp, the Pleasure Ward. I always thought that was just like, it's a little needlessly edgy. And then you listen to a song like Atrocity Exhibition, you're like, no, never mind. The material here definitely is a suiting, because it's like the way he just describes the image of this man contorting his body for people to watch. It's fucking like the end of it's Nightmare Alley. He's the geek. And everybody's coming to see him.
It's powerful because it's like it's obviously about Curtis, and it's obviously about like how he feels performing. And it's like, it's taking that, essentially sharing that experience and making it as horrific as possible for the listener. It's just spine tingling.
Like so like fucking brain damaged that while I was listening to this earlier today, I had the thought, rest in peace, Ian Curtis. You would have loved The Elephant Man, which is like very. I thought it was funny too, and then I let it sit for a minute, and I was like, oh my god.
That's the aesthetic of Joy Division, though. That hazy black and white David Lynch eraser head. It's like you can't imagine a scene set to this music in color. It's like
Yeah.
impossible. I just can't do it.
Yeah, which is, again, we talked about the iconic album cover of Unknown Pleasures. We have another iconic Peter Saville album cover here. This very stark photograph of a tomb, with this, bright white sort of backdrop, again, very sort of angular shape to the way that it's orchestrated, and just the word closer itself. It's very evocative, I would say, or basically as evocative as the first album cover in a very different way. It is an album cover that evokes, not to put too fine a point on it, death. And I mean, this is an album that was, as mentioned before, released after Curtis's death, and very shortly after Curtis's death, in fact, 2 months, I believe, had passed. And so not only does that inevitably hang over the album's legacy and the way that you experience the album, but it's very hard not to read into the songs themselves as being very much about Curtis's reckoning with the inevitability of his encroaching death as he saw it. Like, he knew he wasn't long for the world, and he kind of bled that all into the songs. That said, they're not, terribly personal songs overtly, but they lean into this extra macabre sensibility that I think is particularly fascinating. I think when you are suicidal, or when you are, I suppose, fixating on your own death, the sorts of images that Ian and the ideas that Ian focuses on here are things that you gravitate to out of a fascination. I think just the nature of death for Ian, and the nature of the afterlife, I guess, and all these sorts of ideas are less terrifying or less morbid, and just things that he's fixating on. The first half of the record really does continue with, I guess, curveball after curveball in a weird sense, because none of these are like, completely out of the blue different for the band, but songs like Colony in particular, A Means to an End, you feel like the sense that this band are really pushing against the edges of what they are and what they can be. Like, there's just more. I don't know, how do you guys describe the vibe of the instrumentation as well, and just the grittier, gnarlier sound that this record kind of starts to fully lean into with songs like Means to an End?
I would describe a lot of it as just purely manic. Like, it is definitely like a messier album in a lot of ways, but it feels like in many respects that's just sort of what happens when the band kind of lets loose a tiny bit, but it also just sort of opens the floodgates, as it were, for sort of Curtis to explore weirder vocal and lyrical avenues. Like a song like Passover, for instance, is like, it's written in a very oblique way. A lot of the songs on here are, but Passover to me is a song about like a man talking directly to God, and just like wondering if the path that he's been set along is the right one, if he's so like miserable. And it's like he's in a state of bargaining with it, but the chilling part is the song ends, it's like, and God doesn't answer. And so you're just sort of sitting here in this like raw stewing isolation. Like, before, I would describe Unknown Pleasures as a very cold album. Closer, on the other hand, feels like a feverish album. It feels like I'm like boiling to a point where I'm going to sweat out my insides at certain points, to the point where it really builds up in that first like half of the record, and then there's a bit of a transference in energy for me, especially once we get to my favorite Joy Division song, Another difficult favorite to quantify because I think it's also the band's easily the most disturbing song in their catalog for me, and that's The Eternal. There is no other way to put this other than I think this is maybe the saddest song of all time. It is utterly despondent. It's as skeletal feeling as something on Unknown Pleasures is, but with the sort of palette and fullness of Closer. And just lyrically speaking, it's like this again. Curtis is at his best to me when he is at almost his most intangible. It just allows these sort of lyrical imagery to kind of seep into you, and it just feels like The Eternal gives me the same vibe as like Glass Arm Shattering at the end of Dead Wing, where it's just like a bunch of unconnected, dissociative images that's being described by someone who is like just utterly broken. And just all of the instrumentation here, it sounds so big and slow and lumbering, but like it also has this part in the middle where there are these whooshing synth sounds or fucking something. I have no clue what this sound is, but it is like it robs me of my ability to like breathe. Like it happens and then it just goes, it kind of melts into that kind of really slow, despondent boom, 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 boom. And it's just, oh God, it's indescribable. It's so it really does kind of feel like I mean, this is the kind of song that someone makes before they kill themselves. That's how dark it is.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really talk about it too much. It's a song that
No, it's not fun.
It's also like associated with certain things that I don't want to think about personally. And the second half of this album, I mean, the first half is kind of like deliberately all over the place, like especially a song like Colony, which is maybe the most unfriendly song that they ever put on an album. It's just straight up proto no wave industrial sort of
I was
shit.
gonna
Like
say it's swans.
the
It's literally
drums
just
are
swans.
violent and militaristic and just completely
Yeah, that's a good word.
terrifying. And but from the whole B-side, when you get to Heart and Soul, which is the first song on the B-side, this is like one of the great B-sides of any studio record of all time. Like these are four perfect songs. Heart and Soul in particular has been a long time favorite of mine, just that eeriness to it, but also the way that it sort of slowly simmers. And the weirdly, because this is the thing that I actually have come to really appreciate about this record is that and this is true of Colony in particular, there's a really sardonic sense of black humor on this record as well. Like Colony is just like a really mocking song. I think very much follows out of the God has left me feeling of Passover that just curdles into this sort of resentment and judgment of people who essentially have faith because he's been spurned. So
black
now
humor in the form of like that guy from Lost Highway laughing at the main character at the very beginning.
Yeah,
that kind of black
it's
humor.
like this curdling hatred of God that manifests in that song, and then in the I put my trust in you repetition and a means to an end as well, which is such a fucking just sinister and bitter song. And hearing Ian embrace some of these colder, more bitter and more sarcastic tones to the way he writes and sings compared to Unknown Pleasures really does add to the discomfort that the record induces. Heart and Soul is particularly like nihilistic, with lines like an abyss that laughs at creation, a circus complete with all fools, foundations that lasted the ages then ripped apart at their roots. Beyond all this good is the terror, the grip of a mercenary hand. When savagery turns all good reason, there's no turning back or no last stand. Heart and soul, one will burn. There's points in the song where I feel like he gets as direct as he is on the entire record about his own internal state. I exist on the best terms I can. The past is now part of my future. The present well out of hand. Like the way this song just really takes you down to the bottom part of his soul is bearable. And then I think I have to put a special shout out to 24 Hours, which I don't know. The Eternal, I think I agree with you, Jake, is kind of like the song on this album that is the most personally impactful for me. But I feel like if I were to pick the greatest song in here in terms of like what encapsulates all of the strengths of Joy Division, 24 Hours might be my pick. This song is like, for starters, the uneven tempo of this song and the sense of disorientation that it induces. Again, you have more of that direct personal touch to Curtis's lyricism, but it's a distanced personal tone as well, like this kind of like set in medias res in this conversation between him and either this other part of himself or this confessional person that he is revealing himself to. And the song is so just distorted and intense and heavy and violent, especially by the end of it when it really picks up. God, what a song. It's just completely breathtaking. Morgan, it's been a while since we've heard from you. What are your thoughts on this album relative to Unknown Pleasures and some of these standout moments?
Shit's dark when you make Unknown fucking Pleasures seem cheery.
I'm like, I keep thinking of that clip from Walk Hard where it's like, this is a dark fucking period.
And it's not just that this record is gothic and doomy and depressing. It's that it's fundamentally fucking cracked to instrumentally, lyrically, in terms of Curtis's vocal performance. I mean, we all know what happened to Curtis, but if the other guys in this band didn't also want to walk into the ocean, then it is difficult to tell that. This is a 100 out of 100 album. I think every song on it is a 10. And I probably still prefer Unknown Pleasures just because like I can listen to it like at all. Because I mean, this sounds like it was built from the ground up to be a posthumous record. Like if it almost feels Black Star esque in that sense.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's one of those things where it's like, it's so hard to know, but it's so intense in the way it leans into aspects that of like death and stuff, that it's like it invites projection to a certain extent, like especially with a front man as enigmatic and that so many people connect to as much as Ian Curtis. It's really difficult not to put yourself inside of his perspective and try to sort of understand more and more what he means and where he comes from and what his intentions are and what he's thinking with everything that he sings and does. And it's like it's a it's a doomed task, like it would be with any kind of artist to try and do that. But Ian is one of the great enigmas of rock history, and people will be projecting onto his lyrics and onto records like this and trying to unearth some new understanding hundreds of years from now, as long as music exists and as long as human beings exist.
I feel like too it's sort of important to like consider that this album is more than 40 years old, and there's just not a sect of music after it that isn't influenced by them in like some oblique way, if an oblique way is even required to make the connection there, which most often it doesn't. But I feel like now it's like how we talked about a couple of weeks ago, that the modern musical landscape is so filled with people searching for like maximalist art that I feel like, it's very easy to see why someone would listen to something like Unknown Pleasures and just see it as kind of primitive. But once you start viewing the scarcity and sparseness of albums like that, or the overwhelming kind of like messiness of Closer, you see those as their own extremity that makes them as comparably great as anything made right now or today, or anything that influenced them. And for all the bands that they did influence, I think it's inarguable, or at least from my perspective, I don't think you all will disagree here, but like, if one band, modern band, had to inherit the mantle of Joy Division and what they do and what they did for this kind of music, and how like, not even in like not in an influential way, just because this band isn't as popular, but just taking this formula and maximizing it, is that I think that the next incarnation of this band is actually the Twilight Sad. That is a
If you
band
had
that,
asked me, that would have been what I said. Yeah.
perfect. That's part of the reason I wanted to mention them at the very end here. Is it's just like, thing is about the Twilight Sad also is that nobody fucking listens to the Twilight Sad. So if you're somebody who enjoys these records, please, for the love of God, if you haven't thrown on No One Can Ever Know or fucking any of their albums, fucking Nobody Wants to Be Here, Nobody Wants to Leave, please, please, for the love of God, give that band their due. They are the only sort of post-punk adjacent band I would consider to make work on par with something like Closer, and with the same kind of mood, but with their own identity. Because I think a lot of what's frustrating about Joy Division's influence too is that there are so many bands that are so derivative of them that they don't make room for their own voice. They just, Joy Division Mark II, and they just
Yeah.
don't do much with it.
Well, on that note, then, shall we go into our favorite tracks and ratings for each of these bad boys?
What
Jake,
gonna do?
why don't you lead us off with Unknown Pleasures and Closer?
With Unknown Pleasures, gotta say, 3 favorite songs: Disorder, Interzone. It's either Insight or New Dawn Fades. I'll say Insight. Least favorite track, don't really have one. Nah, I give this a really resoundingly emphatic 8.5 out of 10. And with Closer, three favorite tracks. The Eternal, obviously, Heart and Soul, and fuck it, I'm gonna say Atrocity Exhibition and Passover, because fuck you, I don't care. Least favorite track, I do actually have a least favorite track here. It's a great song and I love Curtis's lyricism on it. Not huge into the sort of primitive sounding sharp synths on the Closer here, Decades. It's still a very, very great song. It's just easily the one I enjoy the least because of that one choice. But I'm probably going to listen to this album enough in the future that won't matter anymore in like a year from now. So who fucking gives a shit, I guess. 9.5 out of 10. Consider me Curtis Pilled.
All right. August has listened to Unknown Pleasures and has it at a 7. Morgan, your ratings, favorite tracks and ratings for each of these albums.
Unknown Pleasures. My favorite ship is Disorder of the Lords' Candidates and Sights, Fading Dawns, Lost Controls.
I've put the 10s in, so there's no pressure here.
Yeah. Good call. Yeah, I'll probably say Shadow Play, New Dawn Fades, and I Remember Nothing. And for Closer, I will say 24 Hours, Isolation, and Atrocity Exhibition, 20 out of 20.
My 3 favorite tracks on Unknown Pleasures are Disorder, New Dawn Fades, and Day of the Lords. Least favorite is probably Wilderness. That one gets an 8.5. Closer, my 3 favorite tracks are literally just the last 3 songs, I think, on the record. And my least favorite track is I don't really think I have one on Closer. That gets an emphatic 9 from me, which means that overall Unknown Pleasures gets an average of 8.5, and Closer gets an average of 9.5. Let us know at home what Joy Division means to you. What these records mean to you. Do you have a favorite? What are the things about these records that stand out to you? Memories associated with them, connections you have. We want to hear from you in the comments below. Your interaction makes a huge difference and helps motivate us to keep doing this. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like and hitting the subscribe button. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, you can do that by heading on over to the link in the description. If you want to go above and beyond and support us further, you can hit the join button, and for just $1 a month, you can become a member of the Jams and Tea family, support us directly, get your name featured on the title crawl of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us music to listen to and feedback on, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Rothies, reduce your carbon footprint in style.